Uh, the verse that we read today is actually, it's one of my favorite stories and favorite events in the Bible. In this story, Paul is on his second missionary journey, and he's in Philippi. And during that time, Paul and his companions, they're walking around doing ministry, sharing the gospel. And during one time, they were approached by this demon-possessed girl who had the ability to do fortune telling. And she was following around saying, oh, these are the men of God. They proclaim Jesus Christ and doing all this. And this was going on for several days, to the point where Paul was getting annoyed by her doing this constantly. So what did he do? What did he decide to do? Finally, he decided to put a stop to all of these things by casting out the demon inside of the girl. Now, this made the owners of the demon-possessed girl furious. Why? Because these owners can no longer profit from this girl who had the ability to do fortune telling, and they were making money through her. So what did they do? These owners and along with a bunch of mob of people, they dragged Paul and Silas to the magistrate, to the ruler, and accused them of inciting a rebellion of some sort. And upon which the magistrate stripped off their clothes and had them ordered to be beaten with rods and thrown into jail, most likely a dungeon, with their feet fastened to a stock. And this is where it comes, the amazing part of the story, in verse 25. After all of these things, in verse 25, it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. When I first read this verse, this is the verse that really stuck out to me. After all the things that had happened, and around midnight, in total darkness, it says Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. How in the world can Paul and Silas be singing hymns to God while fastened to a stock? Let's put this in proper perspective here. What was Paul's crime here? Basically, Paul's crime was to cast out a demon spirit from a girl. So if you really look at it from a very objective point of view, what Paul did was a good thing, was a great thing. He cast out the evil spirit from this girl. And then they were falsely accused. When you look at this passage, they were falsely accused by the owners, saying, they're trying to incite some sort of rebellion. And the owners, they were motivated by greed and the fact that they could no longer profit from this demon-possessed girl. And because of all that, what was their sentence? They were ordered to be beaten and thrown into jail. I don't know about you, but if that were to happen to me, I'd be angry, I'd be bitter, and I'll be sad. So what was Paul and Silas' response to all of this situation? And again, going back to the scripture, it says, about midnight, in total darkness, Paul and Silas, fastened to a stock, began praying and singing hymns to God. These are not the actions of people who are sad, bitter, angry, or depressed. On the contrary, these are the acts of people with hope and joy. How was it that this happened? I believe that there are two reasons why Paul and Silas, they were able to experience joy even in the worst of circumstances. And I want to share with you these two reasons. Reason number one, Paul and Silas was able to find joy even in the worst of circumstances because Paul knew his calling and his purpose. Now, what does knowing one's purpose and calling has anything to do with happiness and joy? The answer is this: when we know our calling, when we know the purpose of our lives, it changes, it affects our expectation. Let me say that again. When we know our purpose, when we know our calling, when we know what we're supposed to do in life, it changes our expectation in life. Now, before I talk a little bit more about this, let me explain to you how these expectation things work. How calling and expectation, purpose changes our expectation. You know, I've said this a few times before, and I've said it for many, many years. Sadness and pain occurs in our lives for the simple reason when expectations do not meet reality. Again, let me say that again. Pain and suffering, pain and sadness occurs when our expectations does not meet the reality. And when you think about it, you realize that is true. Let me give you several examples to talk about it. William's not here, but I was going to talk about it. For example, William experienced pain and suffering a couple of days ago. Why? Just as Pastor Long mentioned, William got his driver's license on Monday. And when he got his license, he was ecstatic and he was happy. But then soon after, he experienced pain and suffering. Why? Because when William got his driver's license, he had this expectation that he was going to be able to drive his mommy and daddy's car whenever he wanted. That was his expectation. And then boom, one day when he came and approached me and said, "Dad, give me your car key," then the reality hit. And what was the reality? And I told him, no, that's not the way it works. This is my car. You just got your license. You don't start driving around the day after you got your license. Now, there are other examples. For some of you, now, maybe just like a simple example of going to a restaurant. Now, when you go to a fancy restaurant, I don't go to a fancy restaurant. I think Pastor Lom enjoys nice steak. He loves steak. He's willing to pay anything for a nice steak. Let's say that Pastor Long goes to this, I keep forgetting that restaurant because I've never gone there, Don Frisco. Let's say Pastor Long went to a Don Frisco restaurant and he paid like $50 for a steak. Is that how much a good steak costs there? Or more? Okay, more. Okay, $75. He pays $75 for a nice steak. But then steak comes out and you know what? It's chewy. It's not the best grade. It's overcooked or whatever it may be. You know what? Pastor Long, he would be angry. He'd be frustrated, angry, and he'd be sad. But why? Because he went in to Don Frisco restaurant with an expectation. It's a nice restaurant. It's got a good reputation. So he went in thinking, you know what? I'm gonna enjoy today a nice steak tonight. And then when the reality hits that, you know what? Oh, this is not what I was expecting. In that moment, he experiences pain and suffering. Now, for me, for us, for those of us who enjoy a nice, simple meal, how many of us have ever been disappointed at McDonald's? Never. We never get disappointed at McDonald's. We never experience sadness and pain at McDonald's. Why? Because when we go to McDonald's, we pay $4 or $5, and our expectation is to eat a nice, juicy, greasy, fattening, unhealthy burger. That is our expectation. And what do we get? We get exactly what we expected. Nice, greasy, unhealthy, tasty burger. So we get cancer. And because we get what we expected, we don't get pain, we don't experience pain and suffering. This past week, I'm going to give you, one more example. I don't know whether you noticed, but, we got a new car. We have a new Hyundai Elantra. And the reason being was because we had our Chevy Equinox. It gave us a problem, and that wasn't the main reason, but it was 5 years old, more than 70,000. And then after 70,000, we had an issue with the car, and once we took it to the shop, they're saying within the next 2-3 months, you have to spend another $2,000 for maintenance, fixing the brakes, replacing the tires, and all these things. And another reason was, we don't need 2 SUVs. We have one, and we wanted another small, economical car that will not eat up gas. And this month of April, maybe because of tax season, Hyundai was having a huge rebate. Now, I don't work for Hyundai. They were having a huge rebate on Elantra. So I took my car to a dealership last week. And before I went, like all of you guys would do, I did my research on the internet. I did the Kelly book, and I was trying to see how much I could get for trade-in for my Equinox. And according to the value, it says I could get anywhere from $8,000 to $8,500 depending on the condition of my car as a trade-in value. So I went in thinking, you know what, I'm going to get maybe $8,500. I'm going to, hopefully I can maybe get a $9,000 for my Equinox for a trade-in value. Well, I took my car to Hyundai Katy Hub near my house. And I gave them the car key, and they came back about 10 minutes later, and guess what they quoted me for my car as a trade-in value? No, they traded $7,000. And when they said $7,000, I experienced pain, sadness, and suffering. Why? This was my expectation. $8,500, maybe $9,000. But then when they came back with $7,000, ouch. Needless to say, things didn't work out. We went back and forth for like 2 hours, and oh my goodness. So Esther and I, we ended up walking out. Pain and suffering and sadness. And then this past 2 days ago, I decided to go to another Hyundai dealership on 290. 290, there's another Katy dealership there. And before I went, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going with another expectation, thinking, you know what? I'm going to hand over my key to the salesperson, and now we're going to spend another 30, 40 minutes going back and forth. They're going to start with $7,000, and I'm going to start with $9,000, and they're going to come back with $7,500, back and forth, and I'm just going through in my mind all of these hassle and stuff like that. And I gave so I went to the dealership, I gave my car key to the salesperson, and he came back, 10 minutes later, and he said, we're going to give you $9,000 for your Equinox as a trade-in value. What did I experience in that moment? Happiness and joy and excitement. Why? Because the reality exceeded my expectation. Even in marriage, whether we're happy or not, it really is about expectation. Just one example. When Esther and I, when we first got married, like most women who just get married, who were single most of their lives, who live with their mom and so forth, who never cook at home, as soon as you get married, you know what? They cook. Well, Esther, when she first got married, like most women, she was not a terrible cook, but she was not the best of cook. I might have shared this story with you. I still remember the first meal she ever cooked for me at our home. It was udon. It was udon. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad, let me tell you. But it did take her 1 hour to cook that one dish. And when I went to the kitchen, it was a mess. But here's the deal. I wasn't angry, I wasn't frustrated, I wasn't sad, I wasn't bitter, or any of those things. I was actually very happy, and I was very thankful. Why? Because my expectation about marriage was this. I never thought, and I never assumed, that it was my wife's job to cook for me. Now, I know some of you might think so, but I never did. So even though, even if she cooked a bad meal, to me, it never made me sad or angry. Why? Because my expectation was like, my goodness, she doesn't have to cook for me, and the fact that she cooks for me actually made me happy. Now Esther, she's really a good cook, maybe really a wonderful cook. She can put something together within like 5-10 minutes. Han, is Esther a good cook? Yes, he enjoys all the good house church food that she cooks. The point of all the stories that I'm telling you is to let us know, to remind ourselves the important role of expectations play in our happiness. So what am I saying? Am I saying that all of us, that we need to have a low expectation in everything that we do? No, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it's not about having a low expectation or high expectation. It's about having a right expectation. The point I'm trying to make is this. When we understand our calling in life, when we understand the purpose of our lives, when we understand why we exist here on earth, that gives us right expectations in life. Paul and Silas in the Bible, they were able to experience joy and happiness, even in the midst of hardship. Why? Because they understood their purpose. They understood their calling in life. Paul and Silas knew that their calling and purpose in life was not about making money, was not about living a comfortable life, was not about going to vacations and eating fine food or receiving praise and all this honor and glory. No, they knew their purpose in life was to serve God and spread the gospel. And with that, they knew also that with serving God comes with hardship and difficulty. In John chapter 15, verse 20 and 21, this is what Jesus said. Remember the word that I said to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. Jesus is saying that on earth, I experienced suffering and persecution. And if you want to be my disciple, if you want to be my follower, you will experience the same thing. Because a servant is not greater than the master. And if you want to follow me, you will experience the same thing that I experienced in life. So for Paul and Silas, being falsely accused, being beaten for their faith, it didn't really make them sad, bitter, or angry. Why? Because it was something they expected. There's another way that knowing our calling and purpose changes our expectation. It changes our expectation because knowing our calling and purpose changes our goal. As a Christian, for most people, and it's not necessarily a terrible thing, it's not a wrong thing, but it's not a right thing. For most of us who live here on earth, especially those of us who do not know God, we have a very worldly goal. What is that goal? We want to be rich. We want to be famous. We want to be respected. We want to be well known. We want to retire early. We want to enjoy life. I mean, a lot of us, we want that as well. But we experience sadness and pain when we don't reach those goals of reaching certain status, attaining certain status, income, or recognition. But as a Christian, even though we want to be rich, hey, who doesn't want to be rich? I want to be rich. I want to have money. Even though as a Christians, we all want money. We all like recognition. We all like praise. We all want to be, known as, doing something important. But as a Christian, that is never our ultimate goal. As a Christian, whether it's wealth, whether it's fame, whether it's status, whether it's recognition, whether it's position, all of those things, we want it, but it's not ultimate goal. But these things are only a means to a greater goal for us Christians. If anything, we know that God makes us rich or God makes us famous. Why? Not for us, but so that we can achieve the end goal of spreading the gospel, of serving God. One of the things I appreciate about Brother Han, I'm going to mention him twice today. One good, one bad. This one is the good one. One thing I appreciate about Brother Han is that, whenever we have activities and events, he always goes like, I'll go buy it, and I'll do all that. And I found out that it's not a cheap item that he's going to purchase. And I always tell him, and I feel bad, I say, hey, make sure you submit your receipts to Pastor Long, who's in charge of finance. Make sure you get reimbursed. And I appreciate what Han's response is every time I say that. He says, it's okay, Pastor Paul. I'll just donate it to the church. And it's not just Han. I see many of you guys do the same thing. I appreciate this type of gesture because to me, it reflects the end goal of serving God. That having money is not the end goal, but it's using that money to serve God. That is the end goal. And when I see that, I appreciate that. When our goal or expectation is to follow God and serve God, it also comes with we also come to accept the reality of hardship and suffering that comes with it. As Christians, we're not CEOs, we're not doctors, we're not teachers, we're not managers, supervisors. What are we? Our expectation is we're all servants and we're all slaves to God. That becomes our expectation of ourselves. I had many senior pastors in my life, and one of the senior pastors I had, he shared this story with me about himself and his ministry. One of my senior pastors from the past, he was actually a very accomplished person. He was well educated in that he got his master's degree and he even got his PhD degree in engineering from Ohio State, which is a pretty good university. And upon graduation, he worked for a medium-sized company in the Silicon Valley in California. And eventually he worked his way up and he became vice president of the company and making well over 6 figures in California. But at the age of 40, he realized his calling to serve God as a pastor. So what did he do? He gave up everything that he had. He gave up his job, everything, and he went back to school. He went back to seminary in California. And after finishing school, after working for about 2-3 years as an associate pastor, I think it was at the age of 46, 47, maybe it was 48, he accepted a calling to be a pastor at a small church in Houston. It was there he shared this story with me. We're talking and among pastors, and he shared his story about when he first started pastoring at this small church here in Houston. He talked about some of the hardships that he encountered. He talked about how during deacons meeting, leaders meeting, one of the leaders, for some reason he didn't like him. So one of the leaders, this is an official leaders meeting, he would always come with a newspaper. Who comes to an official meeting with a newspaper? And during leaders meeting, while he's talking, what he would do? He would be reading a newspaper while the senior pastor is conducting a leaders meeting. Can you believe that? He also talked about, some of the leaders. They refuse to be baptized by immersion. Now, whether you're sprinkled in immersion, this is not life or death issue. But the church that he's pastoring is a Baptist church after all, where everyone is expected to be immersed. And here even some members who say, I refuse to be immersed. When he was sharing that story with me, actually, even as I was listening, I was getting angry and furious. I'm like, how dare they? Who do you think they are? If they're not going to, submit to him, just leave. And I was wondering, and I was thinking to the senior pastor, man, how would he feel? After all, he was very successful in the secular world. Well educated, got his master's, got his PhD, well recognized, with great status. He was a vice VP of a big company where everybody submitted to him, well respected. And he came from a lifestyle where he made well over 6 figures, lived a great life. And all of a sudden, he comes to this place. He comes to a meeting and these people are like reading newspaper while he's talking. And they won't even submit to him to the one little things, which is an obvious thing that he should be doing. So I went to him, I said, Pastor, man, how do you deal with this? What do you do in a situation like that? And this was his response to me. His answer was simple. He said, what can I do except to pray? And then he said, Pastor Paul, things like that, it's part of doing God's work. These things, I'm sure it didn't make him happy, but it didn't make him sad. It didn't make him angry. It didn't make him bitter. Why? Because he knew his calling. He knew his purpose. And when he understood, when he realized his calling and purpose, he knew what the end goal was. Therefore, his expectation was different. Pastor Long and I, we know this too, all too well as well. After all these years, pastoring and being part of a church. As pastors and as leaders, sometimes we're target of people's frustration and anger. There's a saying in sports. Oftentimes coaches, I don't know whether you've heard of it, coaches, sometimes they get too much credit, but at the same time they also get too much blame. And I think that's the case with pastors as well. But it's okay. It's okay. Why? Because we understand that things like this comes with the territory of serving God. We expect this. We expect hardship. We don't think that pastoring a church and being a Christian and serving God and doing God's work, we never expect this to be easy. We understand that pain and suffering and hardship, it comes with the territory of serving God. And also, do you know, in many ways, we even rejoice. Even in our pain, even in our suffering. Do you know why? We can rejoice because in our hearts we know that our suffering and our pain is for the purpose. It serves the purpose of helping other people come to know God. Because we believe that pain and suffering serves the purpose of helping people grow in God. And because of that, even in the midst of our pain and suffering, we can experience joy and happiness, just like Paul and Silas experienced while in prison. I got it. I get it. How Paul and Silas, unjustly accused, unfairly beaten and tortured, and yet, while sitting in the dungeon prison, they were able to pray and sing hymns to God. This is the key to happiness and joy. Realizing what our calling is in life. Realizing that our purpose in life is not to pursue wealth, status, fame, but to realize that our purpose in life is to glorify God through our lives, to be a servant of God. You know, thanks to Brother Han, this is the second part where I'm going to talk about Brother Han. I had a chance to read one of really a good book, Tim Tebow's book. He wrote a book recently, very inspirational book. Tim Tebow, for those of you that do not know, he's a very famous football player who is now pursuing a baseball career. He's one of the most, in sports, Tim Tebow is one of the most liked and hated figure in sports. Why? Because Tim Tebow is unabashed, because of his unabashed display of his Christian faith on the field. He loves God and he lets everyone know it. So people who are Christian, they praise him and applaud. But people who are, anti-Christian, they like, oh man, he's arrogant. Why is he showing off his faith on the football field? And from that book, one of his books, it was an inspiring story. I can't quote you from the book because I don't have the book with me. You know why I don't have the book with me? Because Han didn't give me the book. He only let me borrow the book, and he took it back. So I don't have the book to kind of reference back and give the exact quote and so forth. I don't have it because he only lent it to me and took it back. But anyway, from my memory, in his book, he talked about the fact that even though there was so much unfair negativity and criticism towards him, he said it didn't bother him. He said it didn't bother him because he knew that his purpose and his goal in life is not being a famous football player or a baseball player or be recognized for any other things. He said it didn't bother him because his goal and purpose in life is to share the hope and love of Jesus Christ to others. Because that is his end goal, because he knew that is his purpose and calling in life, expectation, and that changed his expectation. And because of his change in expectation, pain and suffering, it doesn't bother him because he knows it comes with the territory. Key to happiness is realizing our calling and purpose in life, finding our way. But I want you to note that I use the word realize. The reason why I use the word realize is because every one of us has a calling and a purpose in life. God created the universe. God created all of us. I talk about this in my Bible study. When we create, and when God creates, we don't create for no reason. We create with a purpose. When God created us, because God created us with a purpose. Every one of us has a purpose in life. And it's simply, we need to realize what that purpose is. One last thing before I close. I believe there's another reason, another important reason why Paul and Silas, they were able to rejoice even though they were stuck in a dark dungeon with their feet fastened to a stake. It's because they had another expectation. When faced with pain and suffering, their expectation was not that God will simply remove their pain and suffering. That was not Paul and Silas's expectation. You see, when we study the Bible, God never promised us that He would take away our pain and suffering. On the other hand, on the contrary, He warned us that there will be plenty of pain and suffering on earth. What God did promise to all of us was this: in the midst of our suffering and trial, that we will not be alone. That in the midst of our greatest pain and suffering, what God did promise was that He will be with us every step of the way. There are many verses in the Bible that speaks of God's presence and guidance in the midst of our trials. But I want to share with you my favorite verse. In 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 5, it says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too." Here Paul talks about this amazing comfort that he receives throughout his life as he serves God. Recently I heard an interesting take on the story of the Daniel in the lion's den. All of you guys probably have heard the story about a Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel, in the early years of Persian captivity as a Jew, this is one of my favorite preachers. This is named Tony Evans. He shared this. This was his take. He said, basically Daniel, he was sentenced to die in a lion's den. He was put in a lion's den, thinking that obviously that he's going to be killed and eaten by the lion. And he was sentenced to be placed in the lion's den, not for anything evil that he committed, but it was really mainly due to treachery of those who were jealous of Daniel. But here's the interesting part about the story of Daniel. Daniel prayed and seeked after God. But God's response to Daniel was not that God would remove Daniel from the hardship, not that God would remove Daniel from the lion's den, but instead what God did do was send these angels to be with Daniel so that he can endure and overcome the hardship Daniel was facing. Paul and Silas, in the midst of what most of us would consider to be a great pain and suffering, was able to experience joy because, one, they understood their calling and purpose in life, and that isn't to live a comfortable life, but to serve God and serve others. And along with that, they also knew that whatever hardship that they experienced, they knew that God would never leave them. That God will not give them more than they can endure. That God will always be with them and help them to overcome. Pain and suffering is part of life. It's how we approach it and how we deal with it that determines what type of joy and happiness we experience here on earth. This is the path that gives us joy. So I encourage all of you, let us all find our calling, find our purpose, find our way, so we can always experience the joy and happiness in God. Amen?